Hi everybody, Bearded Rogue here, and in honor of this gigantic wrestling weekend, which includes an NXT TakeOver event, SummerSlam, Ring of Honor event going on tonight, and a whole bunch of other things, including the return to action of Cody Rhodes. The vlogs for this weekend are going to be about wrestling. So, my apologies if you're not interested in the wrestling vlogs, but it's something that's really big for me, and so I'm going to talk about it. So today, I wanted to focus on one of the most encouraging things in wrestling in the last year and a half, 2 years, and that's women's wrestling. And I say women's wrestling, and a lot of people who aren't as familiar with wrestling won't know why that's important. So, women's wrestling has been around since wrestling has been around. It's not new. There were a lot of women who wrestled in the carnivals, much like the men did. In the early days of the sport, there were lots of different women who have pioneered things through the ages, whether it was here in the States or over in Japan or in Europe or elsewhere. There's lots of women wrestlers, and everything was pretty good. Although the wrestling scene in the U.S. was never really big into women's wrestling in the major promotions. WCW and WWF had it. But it was kind of like an afterthought for the most part. There have been some fantastic workers. Alundra Blaze was the women's champion for a good part of the 80s and early 90s, and she was Medusa in WCW. She's amazing, and they just kind of imported opponents for her to fight. Like, she was the champion, and that was it. There were no other real contenders. Like, occasionally they would have someone like Bull Nakano come over from Japan and actually be a real threat and stuff like that. But for the most part, it was just, she was the champion and she defended it regularly in the territory as something else to do. It was a lot like Andre the Giant's matches, in that he wasn't in the title scene a lot. It was just a spectacle that they included on the card for variety. Then we got into the late 90s and the early 2000s, and we started seeing some of the performers that I fell in love with when I was really heavily into wrestling in my younger years. Lita and Trish Stratus, and Victoria, and Molly Holly, and a whole bunch of different performers in WWE who were amazing. They were true pioneers. They could totally go in the ring. They were amazingly entertaining. They put on main event quality matches. Like, they were serious wrestlers. And it was something that women hadn't been treated as very often. They were either treated as sex objects or spectacle. One of the two. And these women were real competitors. Unfortunately, the time period they were in still had the mindset of women are primarily sex objects or spectacles, so there's a lot of unfortunate baggage around the amazing effort that they put in. This gave way into the era of the diva, which is a term that I have always hated. WWE decided that all of their female performers were now going to be divas. And everything devolved into lingerie pillow fights and mud wrestling and bikini contests and other just stupidity. Like, I, as a straight male, who was between the ages of 18 and 25 when all of this was going on, like, yes, it appealed to me, but it also kind of upset me, because the women were being treated like props or objects. They were always the secondary character. They were always the manager of some man who was out competing. They were always treated as like the afterthought performers. Even if there were multiple women in the company, only two of them were ever really feuding at any given time. The rest of them just kind of existed in the background as eye candy or for photo shoots on the website. it really didn't work for me, and I was really turned off by Divas Wrestling. Like, Divas Wrestling in general, just like, it was the bathroom break in any pay-per-view or in any show. And there were some really seriously talented workers who were there at the time that, you know, weren't being given an opportunity to actually wrestle. And it was unfortunate, and it was something that upset me about the business, and actually turned me off from watching for a while. And I kind of stopped watching altogether. I still kept up with a lot of the dirt sheets and occasionally visited the website to see what was going on whenever major news happened, but I just kind of tuned out of wrestling completely. And then NXT happened, and I started hearing the buzz about NXT, and it was well after Seth Rollins had left. They were talking about this guy Neville, who was about to be challenging for the championship. They had this guy, Bo Dallas, who's on the main roster, but you wouldn't know it because you never see him. His gimmick was that he was actually a heel who thought he was a face. So he did all sorts of horrible, horrible heelish things, but thought he was the good guy, complete with, like, pearly white smile and thumbs up and everything. It was a really, like, weird gimmick that actually worked for him as a character. When they brought him up to the main roster, they tried to tweak it to make him an inspirational speaker thing, and it just really didn't work. It kind of bombed on the main roster. But in NXT, it was pretty good. He definitely had heel heat. People really did not like Bo. And so Neville was this smaller English guy who was challenging for the title. And how I heard about him was people started talking about his finisher, the Red Arrow, which was this amazing finishing move that people couldn't pull off. Like, they weren't, weren't sure how in the hell he was doing it. It was just an amazing spectacle of a finishing move, and I needed to go check it out. So I pulled up NXT and to watch this specifically, to watch Neville and see what in the hell was going on with that. And while I was watching the match, or while I was watching the program, they were having a tournament to crown the first ever women's champion down in NXT. And the word women's really kind of caught my ear, because that was not something I was hearing on the main roster. It was, like a women's champion, not a Divas champion. Like, they'd even scrapped the women's title on the main roster. They'd merged it into the Divas title, which was this horrible, god-awful butterfly tattoo looking belt. Absolutely horrible. Like, it looked like something you would expect to see in, like, a, lingerie catalog or on an adult toy or something. Absolutely horrible design for a belt. But the women's title was awesome. It was a black strap. It had purple on it. It was purple gems, but it looked like an actual title belt, like a serious belt that a serious wrestler would hold. And I was like, wow, this is really freaking cool. So let's check this out. So I started watching this tournament, and there were some seriously good matches in this tournament. And that's where I first discovered Sasha Banks and Charlotte, and I don't think Becky Lynch was in it at the time, but Natalya was competing. Paige was there, and Emma. And Emma is still one of my favorite women's wrestlers of all time. As far as I'm concerned, Emma is fantastic. She was great in her doofy dancing gimmick. She's even better as Evil Emma. The heel Emma character is amazing, and she can totally go in the ring. But they had this final match between Emma and Paige, and I found myself rooting for both of them. Like, I wanted the doofy Emma to win, but I also wanted this, like, anti-diva with her pale white skin and her gothed out hair and her screaming like a harpy in the ring to win. And it was the first time in a long time that I had watched a women's match that made me give a shit. And at that point, I was riveted. Like, I was watching NXT for all of the amazing developmental talent, but it was the women as much as the men. And that was why NXT initially appealed to me, because it felt totally different. Like, the women were not there for bra and panties matches. The women were not there for bikini contests. They were still beautiful, don't get me wrong. Like, I don't want to imply that none of these women are at all attractive. They were actually more attractive because they could go in the ring, because they were athletic, because they were badasses, because they had legitimate characters, and all of them had an actual reason reason to be there and compete. And the more I found out about him, you know, Charlotte being Ric Flair's daughter and taking up wrestling because her brother, and the bond that she had with him, and Sasha Banks wanting to be a wrestler since she was like 12 and saw Eddie Guerrero, and, you know, actually Eddie Guerrero being like somebody that she not only knew but like aspired to be like, and Bayley, who's also like, Bayley can put on a match with a mop at this point and it will be at least a 4-star match, and that's if the mop doesn't help her at all. It's like, these women are super talented. And so I'm watching them all, and then Becky Lynch gets added to the mix, and then Alexa Bliss gets added to the mix and starts out a little green and starts really applying herself and getting to be awesome. And now I think she's one of the best heels in the women's division. You know, bringing Asuka, who used to be Kana, in from Japan, bringing in Nia Jax, who's unlike any other woman on the roster. She's this mammoth, like, destroyer of a woman, and just looks intimidating as hell, and, like, I just love the fact that women wrestling isn't Barbie dolls anymore. Like, it isn't, you know, bullshit drama angles about fake pregnancies and bikini contests and nonsense. It's about wrestling. Like, the actual legitimate wrestling. They're women competitors, and they're kicking ass, and they're taking names, and they're putting on 5-star performances every week. And it's not just in the WWE, like, it's everywhere now. Lucha Underground. Lucha Underground actually doesn't even have a women's division. The women compete in the same division as the men. So, you'll see Ivelisse, who was one of the Trios champions. That's a 3-person tag team unit. Taking on, you know, big 6-foot-tall, 250-pound bodybuilder-looking guys and holding her own, you know, and then she'll go turn around and put on matches with Taya Valkyrie, who's another woman who kind of followed in Lita's footsteps and decided, hey, I'm a Canadian who would love to wrestle, let's just go down to Mexico and learn how to wrestle. Like, they've put on amazing matches. And then Sexy Star, who is a Mexican luchadora. She's actually recently retired from wrestling, taking off her mask to go compete as a boxer. She and Mariposa is her name in Lucha Underground, but she goes by Cheerleader Melissa in a lot of other places, Melissa Anderson, put on a match that was totally unbelievable. If you get a chance to watch Lucha Underground Season 2, and you don't mind hardcore wrestling at all, check out the No Mas match. No Mas meaning, of course, no more. It's kind of the Lucha Underground version of an I Quit match. And in the whole storyline, Mariposa and her brother, Marty the Moth Martinez, had kidnapped Sexy Star at the end of Season 1 and had basically tortured her and tormented her and played with her mind until she got away. And so now she's this hero who's kind of traumatized by her past experiences. And this was the culmination of the storyline of her finally getting her revenge and her victory over the people who tormented her. And it is one of the most amazingly, blisteringly brutal matches I have ever seen in my life. Like, I would put it right up there with any of Mick Foley's matches for sheer brutality and for sheer badassedness. And both of the women looked like badasses in it. Like, the performance that they put on was unbelievable. And then you add to that Sasha and Bayley with their Iron Man match, or Iron Woman match, as it should be called, going 60 minutes with each other. And, you know, their match at TakeOver Brooklyn last year, which was probably the best women's wrestling match of all time. Psychology-wise, work-wise, thought-wise, it's a hell of a time to be a fan of women's wrestling. Like, there are entire women's divisions out there right now that are kicking ass and taking names that aren't all about the TNA. You know, there are solid women wrestlers all over the planet, and it's becoming something that's being actually put out there where people can see it instead of just at small house shows. It's being given a national stage, which it deserves, and it's so awesome to see. It's one of my favorite things about the last 2 years, is to see this transformation where the stupid butterfly belt is thrown in the garbage and they brought out a legit women's championship for the women in the WWE to go after and fight over, and they're treating treated just as they're treated in a way that they are just as important to the men, and it would not at all surprise me to see women headlining a pay-per-view in the near future on the main roster. They've already done it in NXT, and some of these women are legit good enough that they deserve the main card spot. They just do. The main event belongs to them because they're so good that you can't help but notice them.
What's going on?
Which is kind of Sasha Banks' stage. Be so good that they can't help but notice. And that's really what all of these women did, and they've changed the face of the universe. So, women's wrestling is awesome right now. I suggest you check it out wherever you check it out. Lucha Underground, in Japan, in the WWE, in NXT. Check it all out. It's amazing. Anyway, that's my rant about that. So, women's wrestling, 2 thumbs up. Bearded Rogue, out.